来听物理吗？你化学也听啊？
化学这个一半，第二个听。
哦，怎么样？
挺好的，当时就讲的锂电池的那个。
他有讲其他的吗？比如说为什么锂电池那么不知道比他会是有提为什么锂电他们用锂呢？
为什么用锂呢？因为锂是那个锂是除了氢以外的那个就是最容易失电子。
哦，明白了哦。
比金属里面最容易失电子。
然后他们是第一个用，他们就是第一个有这个 idea 去用锂来做电池。
这有3个人，然后这个教授已经快100岁了。
啊，那他还讲吗？
他讲的，但是他
做这个吗？
他那个对他讲的时候我没怎么看。
那体力不错。一般教授讲课做这个困难，
他做了一下，
他做了啊。
第二个教授是发展，就是他主要是做这么几个。然后呢，第3个就是日本这个教授主要是商用的，做负极。什么叫负极？就电子它会有这么极端的
他是做材料啊，跟我们两个讲他们的负极。
它是一个就是反应理论基础，包括这种嵌入式电池，然后它是做它说是有多种材料，
一个正极一个负极啊，
但是是这么商用的
但是它性能会就是它电会有充了电，那就这2个能有。其他有讲一些。我没看，我就不想看化学的。我学气象的。
在四大。
领导是副教。他们都这边北欧这边都很关心气候，也是气象的发展。就气象这种学科都是就这帮人物理讲这个天体物理，就是行星，就是类太阳系，就是类地行星，他们就是在找这个类地行星。不，他不是找他们找就除太阳系之外的，就是行星。然后他们把这个行星归类啊，就发现地球是很特殊的。中国这锂电池怎么样？
非常强。就是锂电池都是亚洲的产品，中国商用是亚洲的产品。早期一代就是日本、三星啊，
所以他们做这些电器啊都很厉害，电器里面需要。德国应该也。
德国也不错，但是德国
Okay, can everybody please come to a rest? Welcome. So on this gray afternoon, we have gathered here in the beautiful Aula Magna to attend the lectures of another three of this year's laureates, Abhijit Banerjee, Esther Duflo, and Michael Kremer. So in October, as you know, the Royal Academy of Sciences decided to award them with the 2019 prize in economic sciences for their experimental approach to alleviating global poverty. It's my privilege and pleasure to introduce the laureates. Now, first up to the lectern will be Abhijit Banerjee. Abhijit was born in Mumbai, but moved to Kolkata, where he went to school. So with both his parents being professors of economics and India being India, it's perhaps not a great surprise that he would study economics at university. But after undergraduate and master's degrees in Kolkata and in Delhi, Abhijit went on to pursue PhD studies at Harvard. And having held tenure-track jobs at Princeton and Harvard, in 1993, he was recruited by MIT, where he has remained ever since. So one remarkable thing about Abhijit's career is the kind of U-turn it has taken in the last 20 years or so. So being predominantly an economic theorist, he started doing more and more empirical research on poverty and development. And this research became more and more based on RCTs, field experiments. So we hope to hear much more about this in Abhijit's lecture, Field Experiments and the Practice of Economics. Please.
Thank you, Torsten. And thank you very much from all of us, the three of us, but also in a sense, the entire community of sometimes what people call the randomistas, who we represent and whose work, in a sense, we build on and benefit from. From all of them to the Nobel Committee and the Nobel Foundation for this great honor, to our friends and family that have come from all over the world for just being willing to be with us at this moment and cheering for us, and to all of you who have come to listen to me. Thank you very much. I'm going to talk about, as Torsten said, about the field experiments and the practice of economics. Field experiments, sometimes I'm going to use the word RCT for them. In fact, predominantly, RCTs are randomized controlled trials, and the idea of them is to look at interventions through the comparison of random treatment and control groups, people who are randomly chosen to get an intervention and people who are randomly chosen not to get an intervention, to compare them to know whether what impact that intervention had. This is a very simple idea borrowed from the medical sciences, but one which has its own implementations in the social sciences. In just the community of JPAL, which is our organization, the Abdul Latif Jamil Poverty Action Lab, there's about 1,000 of these that have now happened. And what I'm going to speak about is not just our work, but in a sense, little bit of the gleanings from many works of many of those people in that 1,000-person group. And the next talk by Esther and even the talk by Michael will, in a sense, echo very similar themes. And between them, hope we'll give you a sense of where and why the work we've done has been different and possibly important. I'm going to make the claim that RCTs
as I said, where these field experiments have changed economics. And I think they've changed economics in two different ways. One, by changing the day-to-day practice of economics, what we do when we have to answer a question, but also by changing the questions we ask, very different questions. And in a sense, maybe the more profound impact has been that we now think in terms of very different questions, and even the ways we think of what the answers could be are different. And that's maybe the point that is most salient, and I'll try to underscore that as I go through this lecture. In the process, just to make this conversation with economics a bit more salient, I'm going to slightly caricature the practice of economics, because in some ways to explain it in the most nuanced way would take longer than I have. Hopefully you'll forgive me for the caricature. So I think and what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it up as a debate between economics and RCTs. This is not, I mean, when I first started doing RCTs, people would say, that's not uninteresting, but is it economics? And I always sort of struggle to say, what is economics? But I think economics is these things that are meant to be claims, which you may or may not always recognize. But I think and those claims are posited against what RCTs do. So I'm going to try to set up that caricature and then maybe respond to the caricature. So the first general claim that's sometimes made is RCTs are about, you testing the effect of a intervention. You're saying whether changing a particular way of teaching in a school is good or bad. You're not answering generalizable questions. You're not telling us generalizable truths. And that's a claim that is often made. It comes out of a sense that, of course, generalizable truths are what we want. And of course, I mean, people who do RCTs are not entirely stupid, so they also want to have generalizable truths. But we go about it slightly differently. Economics has a specific way of looking for them, which requires. So economics starts with an idea that what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to use the data that we have to infer the deep truths about human behavior. And from those, we will tell you, we'll build a model which will be premised on all these assumptions about human behavior that we're going to make. And from that, we're going to then say, well, the people must have been behaving in this way in order to observe what the data we observe. Once we have that, then we can build from that a story, a model, which would then predict what's going to happen in many circumstances. So it's generalizable through the lens of human behavior. We're going to infer fundamentals about human behavior, and then from that go to generalizability. That requires often having a pretty specific view of human behavior about, people wanting mostly money, and people and how markets work. Usually markets will have to work well. So all of those kind of premises then add up to a prediction. What RCTs do is say, let's just start from an idea. And let's try it in a few places, and then work backwards towards seeing whether we believe that what the RCT is telling us is actually a generalizable truth, or just something that happens to have happened in one or two places. And I want to give you an example of why these two ways of thinking give you quite different answers. And so these starting from fundamental premises of behavior is in an important and crucial way different from starting from empirical observations and then inferring behavior from those. So here is an example which I'm going to take from a field which gave me my first foothold in economics, the field of what is called social learning, the idea that people learn from each other, and that has a particular pattern and a specificity to it. this is, of course, very important in many contexts. If you want to spread a message, you have a serious disease, an infection going on, and you want to contain it. How do you do it? You plant messages about what to do and what not to do. You tell certain people, and you need to know who to tell, and and maybe how to tell them as well. So the question of who to tell has a specific answer within economic theory. Economic theory does answer that question. Once you have, as I said, a model of human behavior, you can use it to make a prediction. And the prediction is typically that you should look for people who are central to a network, people who are connected to connected people. That's the idea that's typically implied by economic models, and it's an idea that you could use. You could go and find those people and tell them, this is the message. Please pass it on. Now, those people, of course, have to be found. So you have to know something about the nature of the network. That's sometimes difficult. You need to know who's connected to whom. A very much more empiricist way to go about it, but inspired by maybe a more informal way of theorizing the world, is the idea that you could just ask the members of the social network. You could say, instead of saying, what is the network and then who's central, let's go to the people and ask them, who do you think would be great in spreading a message? So if you ask people that question, what is striking is people give you quite often the same answer. So when you ask them, they say Abhijit, Abhijit, Abhijit. Who is Abhijit? Abhijit is a gossip. So the idea of a gossip, of course, doesn't actually exist in economic theory. It's not an idea that we have any handle on, but it's an idea that people know. They'll tell you who the gossip is. And we could try that. We could seed the gossips. We could tell the gossips what the message is, and we could see where that goes. And if that works, we could try it again, and we could try to learn about that. This is effectively what we did. We did this in 2 experiments, one in the south of India, in Karnataka, where this was for kind of a trivial application. It was for cell phone raffles. We seeded the gossips, we seeded random people, and we seeded important people. And neither random people nor important people do particularly well. Gossips do spectacularly. Gossips are 3 times as good as everybody else in reaching people. Then the reaction to that was, well, maybe cell phone raffles are irrelevant because, who cares about them? So we tried to do the same thing about vaccination. And again, we ran a race between randomly choosing to seed gossips versus randomly choosing to seed trusted people or random people. So, again, running a race, and it's an experiment. We ran in randomly chosen villages, we seed the gossip. Randomly chosen villages, we seed trusted people or random people. And when we do that, we find that gossips lead to twice as many kids being vaccinated. So those are enormously consequential results. And what I want to emphasize here is not so much a policy point, but that economic theory would have only got us part of the way there. Why? Because the gossips are indeed central in the network. That's part of the reason why they are good spreaders, because they are central in the network. They're well connected. But they're also much chattier than everybody else. They're just conditional on how central they are. They're much better at spreading the message because they're gossips. They love talking. They go to other people and tell them, "Do you know what I heard?" And that idea is simply very hard to get at from the economic theory. The economic theory emphasizes many things, but it doesn't emphasize people's desire to go and share ideas, because there's no benefit to that other than the benefit of sharing. And so the word gossip really doesn't arise in economics. And if we started from a model, we would have never got to the idea of a gossip. And in some sense, the point I'm making, coming back to a generalization, what generalizes from this is a word that would not come out of the economic model. This is the idea of a gossip. The idea of gossip is what is the primary generalized lesson from this experiment, and now we kind of know that gossips are useful. in that sense, I think one of the ways in life our cities are important is they liberate us from using the categories that are dictated by the word economics. So economics is somehow a way of, people are motivated by certain specific things. In a sense, these people were not motivated by those things, or at least that was not what's important, and that this was where our cities helped us. The second criticism of our cities is often that our cities are after small interventions. Economics is about big ideas, big growth, instability, capitalism, socialism, all kinds of big stuff. Yeah, maybe. I mean, I agree that economics could be about these things. I am less convinced that economics is very much useful to say about these things, other than let's say, let's not do what Venezuela or North Korea does. I don't know that we have so much to say about how to stop instability. So I'm less convinced, not about the fact that the question is important, but that we, the contrast of saying we are just solving these big problems, well, maybe, I mean, and you are doing all the small stuff, that seems to me a little bit of a caricature. But also, let me argue that we actually are after big stuff. So here's a question. One of the basic propositions in economics, again, starting from that model, is that making people richer makes them lazier. That's because people love to slack, and having the pressure off, economic pressure off, makes them lazy. Well, how many rich and lazy people do you know? I'll let you think about that. In fact, this is critical because it's a big part of the case against being too generous with poor people. You shouldn't give them too much easy slack because then they'll become lazy. So you should not, give them money because that makes them lazy. So we did actually, one of the nice things about our cities is this is work we did with Rima Hanna and Ben Olken and Gabriel Kreinler. This is about looking at, there were a bunch of our cities where people were given money, and then we looked at what happened to whether they became lazy or not. And while you may want to read what's written in the fine print, the main point is that the two colored bars are identical. Statistically, they're not different, and people don't become lazier when you give them money. There's no evidence that they become lazier. At least poor people don't become lazier when they get money. So that suggests that maybe we shouldn't be so mistrustful of the poor. Maybe we could be a bit more generous to them. So here's an intervention we also studied, which was asking the question, can we be more generous with the poor? Would that be just make them lazy and give up, or would that actually be good for them? This is the study of BRAC's graduation program. BRAC is an NGO in Bangladesh, one of the great NGOs of the world, and they had a program targeted to the poorest of the poor. The poorest of the poor were given a package of some assets, some training, some hand-holding, some temporary cash assistance. All of those. There was our cities in 7 countries, and there was a durable impact. Durable meaning, I'll tell you, 10 years later, we find that the incomes of the people who were given the assets are higher, so there was no evidence they became richer. They own more assets, they work longer, they're not lazier, they work longer, they earn more, they're happier, healthier. After 10 years, they are about, in India, where we follow them for 10 years, the consumption per head is about 30% higher. Income is 30% higher. That was about what it was all along. Similar results. And indeed, for income, we find that between the 3rd and the 7th year, the impact actually grows. So they actually become, rather than falling back towards poverty, they become more and more dynamic and move away from the others. So that's a sense in which and this is similar results from Bangladesh. Now, that made us ask this question: why is it that this happens? Why? And that goes to one of the fundamental questions. Going back to this question of big and small questions, why are some people so small? And there are really 2 theories. One is that they're born that way. That's they are somehow not able to stay rich. They spend all their money. They're lazy. They are irresponsible. In that case, if you gave them something, it will go away. The alternative is that they were poor because they are poor, meaning all their parents were poor. They didn't have an opportunity, and if they didn't have an opportunity, there was nothing they could do to get out of there. This was an idea that has been studied for many years. This is the idea of a poverty trap, and it's in fact work that I think got me into being a development economist. 1 minute, 20 seconds of an anecdote about my life. I started, as Torsten said, as a theorist. I wrote a theory paper about poverty traps, and it had the word development in it. So on the strength of that, and having no training and no experience of teaching development, I was offered a job of teaching development at Harvard, and that then led to RCTs and all those other things that I eventually learned, mostly from my students and colleagues. So that's a way in which my life, like the lives of the people I'm describing, a small accident has durable effects. So this is a very nice piece of work, understanding what's going on, why are these people, how do they manage to stay durably rich? I told you that when you give them the asset, they stay durably rich. How does that happen? And this was studied carefully in this very nice piece of work by Claire Balboni, Oriana Bandeira, Robin Burgess, Moitish Ghotok, and Anton Heil. And the point here was to just look at what happens from year to year among people who have a certain level of wealth today. How does their wealth grow? And the point for wealth to be, if a little bit more wealth leads to a lot more wealth tomorrow, then you could imagine people taking off. So a little bit more wealth today leads to a lot more wealth tomorrow, which leads to even more wealth tomorrow, day after, etc. If you have the opposite, so that a little more wealth tomorrow generates only a small amount extra wealth, then that's going to slow down and you'll fall back. The first picture represents the case where people basically can't escape. They're trapped in poverty because there's no escape, because essentially if you give me a little more, maybe I'll eat half of it tomorrow and half of it day after, and then it'll be gone. The other case is where the relationship between wealth today and wealth tomorrow looks like this, an S shape. And in this case, the key idea is that you see that yellow curve suddenly becoming very steep. What that's saying is that a small amount of wealth today actually increases wealth. $1 today gives you $1.50 tomorrow. And therefore, that gives you $2.25 day after, and so on, and that becomes self-sustaining. And to look at which of these curves apply, they actually looked at the data from Bangladesh, from this asset transfer experiment, and they find that this is what it looks like. You can see that the curve looks like an S, like the curve I showed you. And in a sense, what they're demonstrating is that you can actually not only claim that people are just poor because they're poor, and if you give them a push, they'll keep going, but also that you can show that that's in fact the transition. So you can look at that. And this means that essentially people are going to be either sort of just too poor to make it, and then they'll become poorer and poorer, and you see the hump on the left, or they'll become richer and richer, and you see the hump on the left. The middle will empty out. And that's what this picture shows. This is the distribution of productive assets. So you do see exactly the pattern you might have expected. Why is this important? First, because it offers a possibility of a big bang. A small intervention could have big effects on the lives of people. That, of course, is fundamental in a sense. That's fundamental. And, of course, it means that your social return on investment, the fact that if I give people money that has big consequences in people's lives, that's very good news, because you could give a little bit and get a lot for it. But also, what idea is bigger than the idea that the poorest of the poor have enough talent to be self-sufficient, that if you give them a push, they'll stay up? What idea is bigger than that? In a sense, in the realm of big ideas, this is an enormous idea, because it gives us faith in humanity. What could be bigger than that? And the reason why we did an RCT to do this is because we needed to follow people carefully over time, to understand what's going on. And to do that, we would need to know who were the people who got the asset and people who went. the fact that an RCT gives you a lot of specificity, you can identify the people who should have got it and the people who didn't, and you can follow them over time, means that you can collect data to demonstrate something like this. Without an RCT, it would be much harder to demonstrate. Maybe you could do it, but it would be much harder to demonstrate that there was some dynamic pattern like this. The RCTs give you a very unique kind of data because you know who exactly to follow. And that's the power of that is what this exercise shows. Finally, let me talk the third and last claim or caricature I'll adopt is economics cumulatively builds a theory. RCTs are piecemeal. You do one thing here, one thing there. And I want to, obviously, you know by now my trick, which is to controvert this. And I'm going to go into this same story I was following and ask the question, I already told you there's a poverty trap, meaning poor people are poor because they're poor. Why are people poor because they're poor? What is the mechanism? What is making poor people poor? And what would liberate them from their poverty? So one possibility is technology. Maybe they're just, too poor to be able to use a good machine, and good machines are necessary to increase your income, and if you don't get the good machine, you'll never get there. The alternative is that it's psychology, that when I give you a boost in your wealth, you just feel liberated from the pressures of life, and that makes you perform. Now, both are entirely plausible, and the graduation program that I told you about, the BRACS program, does both. They give you an asset, and they give you some psychological counseling. So it gives you both, and in a sense, both might be working there. So how do we know that both are important, or are both important? Well, are assets enough? So there's multiple RCTs where people were given lump sum cash transfers, so given cash and you at a bunch of cash, and then you see what happens. Some cases this had big positive effects, some cases it had no effect or no durable effect, and the answers were confusing. So one of the things so are these because these are different people with different aspirations, maybe they're different alternatives, or is it something more about the fact that these are really, if you give people cash, that's not enough. You need to do something else. So one of the things we did in Ghana in work with Dean Carlin, Hannah Trackman, and Chris Udry is we gave some people we gave the graduation program, some people we just gave the assets. And when you just give the assets and not the rest of it, not the hand-holding, you actually find that there is no durable effect. That suggests that the psychology might be important. Moreover, to look deeper into this question, is it psychology? What we did was we then took a next step in that experiment. Some of those people were given there was in the program, in the graduation program, there was some temporary cash support. So you got, before your asset becomes, paying, you got a little bit of extra cash to keep you going till your cow gives milk or you start selling. So we randomized how much that amount was. So we gave them either a small amount or a bigger amount. The idea was the bigger amount, maybe it's not that just takes the pressure off them in the short run. Does that make them more productive? And to know whether we're more productive, we actually ran a bag factory. We produced 117,000 bags in the process. In that bag factory, we could see how productive people were. And first, people who got this graduation program were more productive, even though they had assets and therefore they were busier. They were actually more productive as well. They were working harder at both jobs. The second, if you give them high cash support, they were producing better bags at a faster speed. People just seemed to be much more enthusiastic about what they were doing, and as a result, they were much more productive. So, in a sense, what this says is that at least part of the effect here is the fact that being poor paralyzes people. They feel that there's too much pressure on them, and that pressure makes them less productive. And that's so. I want to say that both as a very important insight into why this economic model that it said that if you give people money they'll become lazy. Well, maybe the economic pressure is off, but they're also more enthusiastic, and maybe that's why they're more productive. And in a sense, this is a long tradition of studying this in economics and not so much finding that, income makes people lazier, and maybe that's, the first RCT that we're aware of is the negative income tax experiment in New Jersey, and this already was finding that the people didn't seem to become lazier when they became richer. So going back to the question now, what did I learn from this that's general or big? I think first thing, RCTs are great for, from the point of view of building up a theory. Unlike, I think, the claim that RCTs are about piecemeal, I think they're great precisely because they can be tailored to break up the theory into little pieces. So every piece in the story I was telling, I started by showing you that, when I give people assets, they become more productive, but then why do they become productive? So at each stage, we had a more nuanced hypothesis. First, it was, is it the case that, we do see evidence for a poverty trap? Do we see that S-shaped curve? That's a question we could ask. And then following on that, we could ask, is it enough to give them money, or is it do we need to give them psychological counseling? And then after we thought maybe psychological counseling is important, we asked, is it the case that interventions that just make people more comfortable make them more productive? So all of these steps, in a sense, were important in getting to where we are, where we have some confidence in the idea that people feeling better about their own lives is important for their productivity. This is a process of the theory being tested piece by piece and built up into a narrative. And this is what's nice about an RCT, is that I can design the RCT to answer the specific piece I want to, the intervention I can choose to exactly test the theory I want to test. Something in the world we rarely can do, because in the world things don't actually vary in the way we control. The second, we do not have to do the tests, we don't need to necessarily make a lot of behavioral assumptions. We don't need to assume that people want money. We can test if people want money, and that, or whether they want something else. And the fact that we can test them means a lot of the theory is not tested based on other theories. They're tested based on simply observation or less theory, let's say. And that's also a great advantage of the RCT approach. Finally, you can set up a sequence of experiments in the same location to build up the theories. You can see if the same people treated in different ways give you different outcomes. And that dynamic process gives you a way to test theories bit by bit and build up a story. So in other words, I will end by again thanking all of you. This is just a short list of the people whose papers I talked to you about in detail as we went. There are hundreds and hundreds of others who have simply completely transformed this area. They've taken the idea of RCTs and ran wild in different directions, creating ideas that I think neither Michael nor Esther nor I ever thought of. And that's, I think, the most wonderful thing that's happening to us and to, I think, the field of development economics. And I say with genuine, I think, humility that I think that this is a prize at least as much for all of them as it is for us. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Abhijit. So our next lecture will be given by Esther Duflo. She was born in Paris in the early 1970s, the daughter of a math professor and a pediatrician. So after high school, Esther went on to the École Normale Supérieure, with the intention to specialize in history. So during a year in Moscow, she was supposed to work on her undergraduate essay, but she also worked as a research assistant to some famous economists who were there to advise the new Russian government. And having seen the power of economics to change policy, Esther returned to Paris, finished her ENS degree, turned to a master's in economics, and then went on to MIT for graduate school. Turned out MIT hired her as an assistant professor in 1999, directly after her PhD, and she has never joined another university after that. But Esther's whole career has been devoted to practical research on how best to alleviate poverty in its different shades and form. And in many ways, she has indeed followed that path that she saw in Moscow and become very successful in influencing policy, not the least by linking up many researchers to policymakers. So appropriately, today's lecture is entitled Field Experiments and the Practice of Policy. Please.
Good afternoon. The three of us have been repeating, this is a prize for a movement. So at the risk of embarrassing people, I'm going to try and make that physically clear today. So I'm going to ask the people I'm calling by organization, not by name, to stand up so people in the room can see what a movement is. So let's start maybe by anybody who has ever worked for JPAL or IPA. Anybody who has ever worked for PAD? Stay up, the JPAL IPA people don't get to sit down. Jeff, you also represent USAID. Rachel, you also represent DFID. The Jamil family, the Weiss family. Any affiliates of JPAL? Anybody who has ever run an RCT and who happens not to be an affiliate of JPAL? And any graduate student who is doing development or thinking they might do development. So I'm going to start by clapping for these people. If I forget anybody, yell. But we believe this is a prize for a movement. A movement involves researchers, it involves staff, it involves money, it involves partner. I forgot Pratham. Pratham, where is Pratham? They're not here. So think about Pratham. Any NGO partner, government partner, we can clap them anyways. And I'm Rita. Anybody who, it involves money, it involves partners, it involves thousands of boots on the ground, some of whom are rich today. So thank you very much for that. One of the really magnificent things about this prize is that I genuinely think people are truthful when everybody thinks it's a little bit for all of them. Even our old critics came back out of the woodwork to criticize again just to get a piece of the action, which has been kind of interesting. So I was not really meant to become an economist. As the daughter of a mathematician, I thought I would be an academic. My hero were Gauss or Leroy-Ladurie. As the daughter of a physician, I kind of, and one who was spending time in developing countries, I wanted to be a change maker. That's a photo of me trying to accelerate my career as a change maker. That's in 1991 in Russia, not the year I lived there, 2 years before. I'm 18, and I'm trying to kind of crash into a revolution that is not really mine. I actually did a little bit of economics as an undergrad, but I really had no trust in economists. like most people, actually. So this is a graph from much more recent, from 2017. It turns out that economists are some of the least trusted about their own field of expertise, just above politicians. And it doesn't ask, how much, whether economists are trusted for dating advice, or the trust in weather forecasters is about twice as big as the trust for economists. And I was very much there when I started economics as an undergraduate. I really, again, I wanted to be a change maker. I thought economics was just an elaborate hoax to justify the world exactly as it was by putting some not particularly interesting mathematics on it. And yet, 28 years later, I guess I'm here. I'm an economist. And to some extent, among all of the other people that we talked about, I have become something of a change maker. So this map represents the places not where we are conducting projects, but where JPAL has affected policy in any number of ways. So these are pretty much, there is one of these dots almost in all continents. There are various ways in which JPAL has influenced policies. The way we counted, when we first started, before we became JPAL, we were PAL, Poverty Action Lab. By the way, Rachel, as the first executive director of Poverty Action Lab, has to be credited for that magnificent name. And shortly after, we met Mohamed Jamil, and he was kind of challenging us to think, how many people you think you can affect? And we were like, what's a big number? And we saw, okay, 100,000, 100 million, that seems like a big number. We thought it was a bit of a crazy number. But yet, as of now, the way we count our influence in the world, in the sense of the influence of the whole JPAL network, these 400 researchers who are associated with it, is that over 400 million people have been affected by policies which have been found to be effective by someone in the JPAL network. That's without counting all of the people who have not been affected by policies which are found to be ineffective by the JPAL network, which is probably also an important number, but a little bit harder to track. So what I want to talk about today is how that change happens. So let me start a little bit like Abhijit by the straw man. So the straw man is that you run a small, well-designed experiment, very controlled, with very excellent partners, maybe 100 school, 50 treatment, 50 control, really tightly monitor what is going on the ground, get some effects, so that's your results. Then you prepare a shiny policy brief, and then you peddle it to policymakers, and then they adopt, and there is full-scale adoption. So that's kind of the straw man. Maybe to some extent it's a bit more than a straw man, in the sense it might have been the model that at some point, at least I personally thought would be kind of the model we would follow. But it turns out that it's not the model. So let me first start by saying what are various criticisms that people have expressed to this model. Well, if you run small experiments, they are gold-plated, so when you go at larger scale, you won't have the same effect. Also, if you run an experiment somewhere, the result will be valid for this one place, but how do you know that they will be valid elsewhere? And in any case, all experiments have some issues, so are you sure that you really have a perfect solution? And then when you prepare your policy brief, even if we could believe your results, the policymakers, are they going to be interested? It really depends on what they are doing, and nobody is going to pay much attention anyways. And if they did, when they're actually going to implement the project, for all of the reasons above, plus the fact that when something is scaled up, stuff happens, the effects are not going to be what you expect. There is going to be effects that are going to be different in equilibrium. There is going to be some political economy reaction, and so on and so forth. So really, the idea that you can go from a small experiment to widespread adoption is a myth. And well, maybe, but it turns out that it is really not the way that it works. You don't just do your small experiment, write your policy brief, and go away. It is not at all the way that the policy influence, the policy dialogue, I would say, has taken place. Let me give you some example of various ways in which this is quite different. So the first one I want to start with is microcredit, because in a way, microcredit would be the closest model of this, in the sense that the impacts that were found have had an influence on their own without even direct follow-through with governments or with organizations. But even there, as I'll describe in a minute, the process is much more elaborate than just doing an experiment, getting the results, diffusing them. So in the 2000s, as you might well remember, in Scandinavian countries, microcredit was all the rage. It was all the rage in the media. Of course, Mohamed Yunus received the Nobel Prize in 2006. And the idea that it had such a large scale, today it reached about 200 million people, that it had the possibility to change the world. If it was effective, it would have massive effect. And there was a lot of anecdotes that it could help. You had a lot of success stories, etc., but very little hard evidence on whether it had any effect on poverty. And then the tone shifted somewhere actually shortly after the Nobel Prize, which I hope is not a harbinger of things to come for us. And you started hearing like bad stories, mostly from the media, mostly anecdotes of people trapped in microdebt, of farmer suicide, of people who were kind of under too much debt from microcredit, etc. And we still had on either side, no evidence to say either ways. And all this time, several of us had been quite desperate. Dean here and Abhijit and I and others had been desperate to find a partner to do an evaluation of microcredit. But while the going were good, there was not too much enthusiasm for an impact evaluation for microcredit. And finally, we started to get some traction. And the first two projects were in the Philippines and in India. In the Philippines, the effects were kind of okay. In India, they were kind of not great. But when we got the India results, we were actually very wary of diffusing them. Because the first evaluation we had done, Rachel and Abhijit and me were involved, and Annie was actually running around trying to get it off the ground. This was in Hyderabad, which is the hotbed of microcredit in India, saturated with other forms of access to credit. So we felt, well, maybe that's why it could be that it's why it's not that effective, because there is so many other alternatives that people have. So we kind of sat and waited and didn't do much with this result, certainly in terms of diffusing them, because we didn't think we had enough to go on for anybody to draw a conclusion. And then progressively studies started to accumulate, and finally we could put them all together and publish them together with the same format and the same template, which allowed to analyze them together, which is some work that Rachel Meager, who was at the time a PhD student at MIT, did, which is to say, let's look at all the countries where we did microcredit evaluation. We can look at the results individually, those are the blue chart, or we can try to combine them together with some statistical modeling and say what they tell us together, and in particular, do they want to tell us all the same story, or are they going all over the place? And what you can see from the red dot, the red bars, is that they want to all tell us the same story, which is, not much happening in terms of profit anyways. And if we look at average effects on various things, really not much happening either way for the average person, which on the one hand means no one is really hot, but on the other hand means the average person doesn't get out of poverty because of microcredit. Another thing we found, though, from this series of studies, that if you look at people who already had a business before microcredit started, then those people actually benefit from microcredit. And in fact, we've continued to follow them over time, and we see that they start benefiting a lot 10 years later. So it's not that there is no effect on anybody, but the effects are heterogeneous, and the average effects are quite mediocre. So that led to sort of a changing in the debate. from this is a disaster versus this is a miracle to, and that's quite remarkable for the media, a relative kind of neutral tone. Small is smart, a partial marvel is probably the best title, but then it's The Economist, they are good at titles, or small chance. So that changed the policy debate. It actually changed also the view of many microfinance organizations, and of course, eventually changed microfinance, because we were not against microfinance. In fact, a lot of us really want microfinance to succeed. What this result suggested is that the product that were evaluated, which is this one-size-fits-all type of product, really is not ideal, probably, because on the one hand, there is heterogeneity. Some people need something else. Some people really need consumption finance. Some people need business lending with more flexible loan, etc. So the second wave of experiments on microfinance was very much about experimenting on the terms of microfinance, finding out, for example, whether people would do better if they had a grace period of a month before starting to repay, seeing whether the group structure, which is very rigid, was really that necessary, trying to find ways to identify the most entrepreneurial of the possible clients and lend to them, and so on and so forth. So that this set of work doesn't lead to saying to a one yes, no microfinance, thumbs up, thumbs down, but how do you make microfinance into an effective product for the relevant segment of the population? Let me give you a second example, which is an example where it was more than producing the results and then a new wave of working together, but it was going from this time a positive result all the way to policy impact at scale, and try to give you a little bit of a sense of how that takes place and how that's far cry from just getting the results and moving out. And that's the example of teaching at the right level. So in many developing countries, a key feature is that many kids are in school, but most of them are not learning very much. So this is a picture for India, where you can see that a little under half of the kids can read at standard 2 level when they reach standard 5. The performance is even worse in mathematics, where it's closer to 25%. So of course it's a huge waste, and a bunch of experiments have taken place which can help us see whether it's because they don't have inputs. In fact, Michael's very first project was on textbooks. So is it a lack of inputs? Is it because teachers are underpaid? Is it because they are not willing? Is it because parents are lazy, and so on and so forth? And cutting a long story short, it's really none of that. What it really seems to be, in a large part, is that the pedagogy is inappropriate to most of the kids. In fact, most of the developing countries which are former colonies still have this very elitist curriculum, which are coming to some extent from the fact that originally the systems were set up to educate a small elite that was going to be helping the colonial power. And then at independence, the system was just expanded as is, because it's politically very difficult to somehow scale down, because it's a little bit like if you were shortchanging the children. But the result is that kids are taught not at all at the level where they can learn, but at some aspirational level, which is way far what most of them can comprehend. So then the solution seems deceptively simple, is to teach them at the right level. Now one could think the ideal thing would be to do it through the curriculum, but as I said, this is not really a popular move. So we started working, in fact, it was my first RCT, started working with Pratham. And this is Rukmini Banerjee and Madhav Chavan, the first people from Pratham we work with, the first and the second leader of the organization. And the idea of Pratham is very simple. You have to teach to the kids you have in front of you. So what I have is to rearrange, the way the programs works today is to rearrange the kids by level all the time, by achievement level in a frequent way, and then target the activities to where the kids are. And we started evaluating this project. The first version of the project was a remedial education program that we evaluated with Sean some time back. Then we looked at it in more rural areas. And then we started getting interested in whether teachers could implement this approach, and this was done in summer camps. and they could do it, and in all of those cases, the results were positive. One shortcoming of doing the project on a volunteer basis is that you don't have all the children that you would like to have, because they don't necessarily come. So it seems like a waste that they are in school all this time and not being taught at the right level, and it seems that it would be more efficient if the teachers could teach at the right level. So Pratham got very interested in scaling it up via the education system, which of course makes a lot of sense, and they started to get some traction in doing this work. And when they got some traction doing this work, we could evaluate their work by carving down some villages to do, if you want, the reverse of a randomized control trial, where what we have is we carve out a control group in an environment where most of the schools have the program being tested. So we can test this kind of scaled up version by carving out a control group from an otherwise sea of treated areas. And what we found there when we did it the first time is that although the teachers had been quite excited to be trained, when they came back to the schools, they didn't implement the program. And as we had this program going on, we had a qualitative work done by Indian organization, and interviewing people up and down the hierarchy. And what came out of it is that the teachers think it's nice, but they don't have time to do these activities because they have to complete the curriculum, which, by the way, they have to do by law. So you cannot blame them to want to complete the curriculum because it happens to be their job. And of course, this also happens to be their job because it had been scaled up within the government, but it had not been really conveyed. So in the presence of these different tensions between their activities, they decided to stay safe and continue teaching the curriculum. So then if the answer was, and that's something where we had the complete, we kept talking to Pratham, discussing with them. They are ahead of the game most of the time on us, but having the study helped in figuring out that there was a problem to solve. The answer was like, you either need to carve out a time in the year, so doing it in short bursts of camps, or you have to carve out a time in the day, say an hour per day, and you have to make it very clear that it is their job by involving the hierarchy, by involving their bosses. So the new versions of the program either worked in short bursts of activities, or with teacher, or with during the regular school days, but in a dedicated time with training of the teacher supervisors, who were then able to kind of relay the program, both help, but also remind them that, yes, this is in fact part of your job, and you are not to convert the hour into something else because you want to complete your curriculum. In the meantime, there had been some tests of the same program in Ghana. Annie was leading a team of Ghanaians to India, lost some of them along the way, so that's part of the danger of doing policy making when you lose your higher official of the Ghana education team in the middle of India, but they got found. And thanks to that, the whole thing didn't get stuck. And then these two models that I talked about, the camps and the teacher-led model, happened, and both of these showed positive effects. And if you know, this is a long way in coming in having a program that actually has a lot of staying power, can actually be scaled up. And now this program is being scaled up. So these are some of the co-conspirators in this work. Now this program actually is being scaled up, not only in India in a large way where it reached several million children, but with support from Co-Impact in many countries in Africa right now. So this is to give you a sense of how the project of going from a nice proof of concept to an actual scalable program goes on. What should have been clear here is that the process of working together to develop a project that can be implemented at scale is not something that academics do sort of in isolation of the organization or as the giving advice and being somewhat superior to the organization or whatever. It's really a project of co-creation. And that project of co-creation is now very much going on as well, directly with governments. where a lot of the work that many affiliates of JPAL and IPA and others who run RCT do is now to work directly with governments to help them do what they would like to do anyways. So in some cases, I've called this addressing the plumbing problems, in the sense that it's not about, oh, should I invest in health or in education, but it's about, well, I have this, say, rice distribution program that is currently going on, and there are issues with it. What can we try to make it work better? And so the example of that is that I'm going to give today is a work by many people whose photos you're going to see in a minute. And it's concerns the rice distribution project in Indonesia. The rice distribution program is a massive redistribution program, which is funded centrally but administered locally, and has an extremely large budget, and has, as many programs, a lot of issues. In particular, it has the problems that the poor receive only 30% of the subsidies that is intended, and pay in general more than what they should be paying for, about 25% more. And the reason the government failed was in part that they are not properly informed that the program is going. So Ben Olken and Rima Anna, who have been working in Indonesia for many years, have a very long-running, standing relationship with the government, and there is often a back and forth between possible project and possible policy ideas, where the government comes up with them for questions. And here the question was, what about if we distributed a card that made people aware that they are eligible for this program? And they said, well, why not? So this is now the full team: Abhijit, Rima, Jordan, Kyle, Ben Olken, and Sudarno. What did they do? What did they say? They said, well, great, we can set up an experiment. In fact, we can do it on quite a large scale because this program is everywhere, and distributing cards is not particularly expensive. But as long as we are going to set up an experiment, why don't we try not only whether distributing cards would be effective, but also what would be the ideal ways to distribute the cards? So why don't we vary, for example, the information that's on the card? Would it be important for people to know what's the price at which they are eligible for the card, or would it not really matter? So you can see the difference in the cards. Would it matter if everybody who is eligible gets the card, or just a few in the village so people know the program exists? Would it matter if we plastered the village with posters such that not only the eligible people know that they are eligible, but the officials know that they know, and the people know that the officials know that they know, and so on and so forth, such that it changes the way in which people bargain? Would it be important if the cards also had some clip-on coupons that the official would be supposed to give up upstairs to create also the impression that there is accountability in the program? So not only they tried the cards, but they tried all these versions of the cards. And when they did that, they found not only the effect of the cards, but also the best version of the card. The best version of the card is to have the common knowledge and to put the price in and to give it to as many people as possible, and the accountability is not that important. And that version of the cards increased the take-up of the program a lot. Overall, distributing cards increased the take-up of the program, increased the subsidies that people get, which is a combination of the take-up and the price paid, by 26%, driven by a reduction in leakage. So obviously, it's very cost-effective because it's not very expensive to distribute cards, and therefore it's something that the government scaled up almost immediately after they were finished with the program. So here you can see an immediate scale-up following the research project, but that's because the research project is part of the government functioning itself. And there are several examples like that. I just wanted to give you one more, because it's one which involves, again, a quite focused process of really thinking through an economic problem together with the government partner, combining a good knowledge, or a decent knowledge, let's say, of economics, with excellent knowledge, I would say, of the institution on the ground. And that's the reforming the auditing of farms in Gujarat. That also is, I think, an important project in terms of its themes, because it's about pollution and reducing pollution and curbing climate change is one of the big challenges we'll have to solve in the years to come. So Gujarat is actually has been kind of on the forefront of trying to do something about their pollution problem. It's actually one of the most polluted places in India, one of the fastest industrial production state in terms of industrial production, and therefore in terms of industrial pollution. A few years ago, the court forced them to create a third-party audit system, which is one system where each firm has to hire an independent auditor to give them an audit every year, a clean bill of health in terms of environment. So that sounds great in many ways, because you have people with competence that come in that might not exist within the government, but it's not great in a pretty key way, which is it creates a conflict of interest between the auditor and the firm, because the firm pays the auditor, so the auditor has all of the incentive to give the firm exactly what they want, which is a clean bill of health regardless. So we, to find that if it was really an issue, so we were discussing with the government, they really had a sense that this was a problem and that the audit system was almost defect. And that's actually why we got in touch with them. But to test it, we compared the result from the audit firm. So these are the audit report. And you can see that most of the firms are right below the threshold in terms of this particular pollutant, SPM. So either that means that the firms are really competent at targeting their pollution level, or that means that the auditors are making up the data to be exactly in the right place. And of course, the latter is correct in this case, because once you back-check those firms, you find that the true pollution of the firm is all over the place compared to the audit. So the back-checks are performed a few days after, and you can see how the pollution actually distributes, with many firms polluting much more, some firms polluting even much less. That means not only they are making up the data, but they're not even taking the trouble of going to the farm. But that said, if you're going to make up the data, why spend the cost of actually collecting it? So what we proposed, that's Michael Greenstone, Rohini Pandit-Nikhai, and myself, what we propose is to say, look, the problem is really the conflict of interest. There is the loyalty of the auditing firm is to the polluting firm, it's not to society. So you have to break that down. So instead of having the firm hire the auditing firm, create a pool which is going to be used to pay the auditors, number one, then randomly assign the auditors to the firm to be monitored every day, and then pay them based on their accuracy. So once we did that, we had a much more accurate treatment. This is now the treatment and the back check, and you can see that the audit in the treatment look very much like the back check. So basically, almost all of the lying of the auditors got removed by simply having this in place. So that's an example where we were kind of working with them, bringing our economics, bringing our knowledge of the institution to do something together. Here again, they adopted it for all of Gujarat. So the Supreme Court approved it as a way of implementing the scheme, and this is now what is done in Gujarat. More generally, these examples and many others like that are an example of what we are trying to do, which is try to, in a sense, slowly, little by little, making ourselves irrelevant by fostering a culture of learning, both within the government and within all of the institutions that support them. So many governments have launched units that do a randomized control trial on their own, like the Minelu Lab in Peru. We have long-standing partnership with government, for example, the Tamil Nadu research partnership. And the hope is that one day, in a sense, we can make ourselves irrelevant, and that would be kind of the culmination of the process if the culture of learning had developed so much that it would take place by many actors in many different ways. Thank you very much.
Good. So our last speaker will be Michael Kremer. Michael was born in New York, but he soon moved on to Kansas, where he got his high school education. College was at Harvard with an AB in social studies. It might have been 1985. But from there, Michael went directly on to Western Kenya to work a year as a volunteer as a teacher in school. And by sheer serendipity, that year turned out to be instrumental for the first field experiments that he would run several years later. However, before all that happened, Michael took a PhD in economics, also at Harvard in 1992, and like Abhijit, he started off his career by publishing some ingenious theoretical papers, mostly on the macroeconomics of development. He had his first jobs at MIT, but returned to Harvard about 20 years ago, and he has stayed there until today. And today, Michael will speak on experimentation, innovation, and economics. Please.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and a big thank you to the Nobel Committee for the recognition of our work and of the field as a whole. Growing up, I was fortunate to be mentored by Larry Weaver, a theoretical physicist at Kansas State University. Larry taught me the beauty of elegant mathematical theory. He taught me more when he mentioned that a colleague had found a mistake in his work. I expected Larry to be upset, but instead he was happy because he cared about advancing science. I thank Larry for exemplifying a commitment to science as a collective search for truth. Thank you also to my father, Eugene Kremer, who taught architecture at Kansas State. Watching him design and redesign something as simple as a poster taught me the value of craftsmanship. So to all my co-authors who've had to put up with my endless revisions, now you know who to blame. I'm grateful to my mother, Sarah Lillian Kremer, a literature professor. She taught me that it's our obligation as human beings to address injustice and suffering if we can. I think it was my mother's influence that led me to become a development economist. I thank my wife, Rachel Glenister, both for her critical contributions to the experimental approach to addressing poverty and for endeavoring to keep me focused on the values that brought us to this field. I'm grateful to Rachel and to our wonderful sons, Ben and Daniel, for their love and support. As Abhijit has eloquently said, the experimental approach recognized today helps us to develop a fuller understanding of the world and to advance science. As Esther has said, it can help inform decision makers, and by doing so, has already expanded opportunities for hundreds of millions of people around the world. Today, I hope to show you that in addition to these two vital functions, the experimental approach can be a powerful tool for policy and product innovation. In other fields, such as biology, scientific advances and technological innovation feed back into each other. We're reaching a similar stage in economics as well, one which simultaneously advances both science and human welfare. Today, I'll first lay out some key features of the experimental approach. I'll then provide some concrete examples and show how these features make economics an important tool for innovation. I'll conclude by discussing the need not only for innovation itself, but for meta-innovations, innovations in social institutions designed to accelerate scientific and technological progress and orient it towards human needs. So starting with some key features of the experimental approach. Oops, sorry. My understanding of the experimental approach in economics has changed considerably since 1994, when I first started conducting randomized evaluations in Kenya. I initially saw them primarily as a way to cleanly isolate the causal impact of a program or policy from potentially confounding factors. I now see them as creating an opportunity for a fundamentally new type of economics research. I'd like to lay out 5 key features of the experimental approach. First, being able to isolate causal impact is indeed a very powerful tool. Field experiments have frequently shown that policies have very different effects than we believed based on non-experimental correlational evidence. Ironically, the very constraints imposed by experiments open up new opportunities by forcing us to work in new ways. So in particular, experiments provide economists a much richer and deeper sense of context than we would otherwise have, not least by requiring us to spend time in the field. While most empirical economists previously worked with existing data sets, the experimental approach requires researchers to talk to farmers, teachers, students, and small business owners where they live and work. That, in turn, is useful in generating new hypotheses to test. Third, field experiments address very specific, practical problems, while also often shedding light on larger conceptual questions. Fourth, experiments are inherently collaborative, requiring us to work with practitioners and governments and civil society, teams of survey enumerators, and specialists in other fields. This allows the ideas and experiences of a much broader set of people to enter economics research. And fifth, the modern experimental approach is iterative, both within and across teams, research teams and practitioner teams. This is an important difference between the pioneering randomized controlled trials of the 1970s, which evaluated individual large-scale government programs, and the modern wave of experiments that began through collaboration between researchers and NGOs in the small town of Busia, Kenya. One experiment might test the impacts of a multifaceted program. A second, perhaps with very different researchers, might seek to understand which components drive the effects or test hypotheses regarding the underlying processes at play. A third might examine if the results could be improved with tweaks to program design, or if similar results hold in a somewhat different context. This is possible in part because NGOs tend to be more nimble, and our smaller budgets forced us to innovate. This smaller scale, relatively nimble approach occurs alongside larger scale evaluations of government programs that have reached hundreds of millions of people, such as the seminal trial of conditional cash transfer programs by the Mexican government. As Esther has noted, the way we learn through the experimental approach is not a single breakthrough in one paper, but the accumulated wisdom and insight from a series of papers. We see this as a prize for the whole community of researchers and practitioners working together to apply the experimental approach to development challenges. These 5 characteristics together make RCTs a very valuable tool for science, as Abhijit noted, and for policy, as Esther explained. As I'll discuss today, they're also an important tool for innovation. I initially thought of experiments primarily as evaluation, but I now realize that many experiments are more akin to beta tests, useful in developing new products or policies, not just studying existing ones. Spending time in the field, collaborating with practitioners and specialists in other fields, studying specific practical problems, and iterating within and across research teams lead naturally to generating solutions, ones that have begun to benefit millions across the world. So let me turn to some examples. After finishing my PhD and getting my first job, I made a trip to Kenya to visit the friends I made when I taught school there in the mid-'80s. One of those friends, Paul Lapea, had just been hired by an NGO focused on education. A central debate in the literature on education economics at the time was the relative importance of resources versus incentives. To overgeneralize a bit, some argued that providing more resources would improve learning, while others argued that teachers and administrators needed better incentives. But even funding skeptics believed, based on common sense and correlational evidence, that remedying a shortage of textbooks would increase learning, and indeed they saw textbook spending as particularly cost-effective. So the NGO decided to provide textbooks, and Paul Gleve, Sylvie Moulin, and I helped them evaluate the program. To my great surprise, we found providing textbooks had no impact on average test scores. Like many failures, this helped us learn something important. That, however, required acknowledging the failure and having a rich sense of context. The school system at the time in Kenya, as in many other countries, was oriented towards the highest performing students. For example, school in Kenya is taught in English, the third language for most pupils in the area. Schools were judged in large part based on their top performing students, and hence focused their efforts on them. Many students fell behind the official curriculum, for example, due to malaria, worms, or the need to stay home from school to care for siblings. This suggested the hypothesis that if some students fell far enough behind that they couldn't follow the textbooks, providing textbooks wouldn't do much good. We realized we could test this theory by looking at how providing textbooks affected students with different initial learning levels. Consistent with that theory, the students with the highest initial textbooks benefited substantially, but others did not. So the combination of rigorous testing of causal impact and a rich sense of context enriched our thinking. We started off thinking about resources versus incentives, but wound up with an illustration of how the orientation of education toward elites can disadvantage other children. Of course, subsequent work has gone much farther. The wonderful series of papers that started with that Esther and Abhijit discussed, starting with work with Sean Cole and Lee Linden, beginning with that, a process of iterative development and testing allowed organizations such as Pratham to refine and widely deploy innovative new approaches such as targeted instruction. While textbooks had a smaller impact than we expected, another strategy, deworming, had a much bigger impact than anticipated. So as background, more than 1 billion people worldwide are at risk of intestinal worms. Worms are particularly common among school-aged children, which is why the World Health Organization recommends mass treatment of children in endemic areas. Edward Miguel and I used the staggered rollout of an NGO school-based deworming program to examine its educational impact. In the short run, we found that the program reduced school absences by roughly a quarter. It wasn't just children who were dewormed who benefited. Other children in the same school, and even in nearby schools, also had lower worm loads and better educational outcomes, presumably because mass treatment decreased disease transmission. In the long run, the program increased the fraction of girls finishing primary school and entering secondary school, and increased students' future earnings enough to pay for the cost of the program 100 times over. In fact, just the increased tax revenues governments collected as a result would more than offset program costs. With technical support from the Deworm the World Initiative and Evidence Action, the Kenyan government scaled the program nationally. Later, various Indian states, and eventually the Indian national government, adopted similar programs. More than 150 million children across Asia and Africa are now being helped each year. When our work started in the 1990s, many policymakers and NGOs, including our partner NGO, thought it was important to charge people for preventive health products such as mosquito nets, water treatment solution, and deworming pills. We convinced the NGO to try providing free deworming pills at a subset of schools. we found that even the NGO's small fee, less than 40 cents per child, dramatically reduced use of deworming medicine, down to just 17% compared to the 70% who participated with no fee. A fantastic series of papers by Pascaline Dupont and others found the same pattern in other contexts, while cleverly testing and finding no empirical support for hypothesized benefits of charging for preventive health products. So those results helped lead to new and better health policy. Inexpensive preventive health products are increasingly provided for free, saving lives and improving health for hundreds of millions of people around the world. Similar patterns in which valuable investments have been left unexploited arise in many sectors other than health. For example, Esther Duflo, John Robinson, and I found that many farmers did not make apparently profitable investments in fertilizer. Traditional economic models would have predicted that farmers, being perfectly rational, would jump at such profit opportunities. Historically, when economists saw surprising data like this, they tended to stick with their assumption of rational decision makers and develop ever more complicated explanations consistent with rationality. Development economists have been able to use the experimental approach to iterate rapidly when they find anomalies, testing both theories consistent with rationality and theories from behavioral economics. One of the contributions of the experimental approach has been to show, over several studies and contexts, that behavioral models are often of great practical importance. In this case, we tested a behavioral model of procrastination. Consistent with the model, we found that small, time-limited discounts designed to create a deadline effect had as much effect on fertilizer purchases as much larger discounts without the deadline effect. Insights from behavioral economics also led to innovative new approaches to the provision of clean water. Diarrheal disease, often caused by contaminated water, is a major cause of child death in low-income countries. Ted Miguel, Jessica Leno, Alex Swane, and I evaluated an NGO project in Kenya in a region where open springs are an important source of water. These springs are easily contaminated, so the NGO protected them by encasing their sources in concrete. Both in tradition and in law, people in the area had the right to collect water from springs on their neighbor's land. As an aside, these types of communal property rights are common across the world. Many economists believe that establishing private property rights can spur investment. So in this case, allowing landowners to charge their neighbors for water might encourage them to invest in upgrades, like encasings to make their water sources cleaner. Under certain assumptions, we could estimate how much people would be willing to pay for cleaner water by measuring how much farther they were willing to walk for it. We found that very few people were willing to walk far to obtain cleaner water, suggesting that landowners would not be able to charge much for cleaner water, and therefore few would find it profitable to invest. In fact, we estimated that creating private property rights for landowners in water on their land would, in this context, lead to substantially worse drinking water because people would switch to dirtier public sources, such as streams or lakes, rather than paying for clean water. This is an example of how field experiments can be combined with other techniques in economics, such as theory-based structural modeling, to address questions such as the impact of different property rights systems that are themselves less directly amenable to experimentation. But returning to the project evaluation, we found that spring protection helped. An indicator of fecal contamination at the springs fell by 2/3, and diarrhea rates fell by 1/4. However, we also found that water often became recontaminated in storage or in transport to people's homes. So we had to come up with a better solution. Treating drinking water with chlorine kills microbes and keeps stored water safe for 1 to 3 days. Households can buy water treatment solution and treat their water themselves, but many are not able to do so. We tested many possible solutions, and settled on a large dispenser of water treatment solution put right at the water source. When people collect water, they can add the right dose of chlorine by turning a knob. In designing the dispenser, we drew on our previous studies and from wider lessons from psychology and behavioral economics to try to increase usage rates. The dispenser was salient, big and bright blue, and placed right at the water source. It was incorporated into something people already did, water collection, so use was convenient and could quickly become a habit. It was visible to others in order to facilitate social norm formation. And importantly, it was provided to customers without charge. The dispenser increased water treatment fourfold, and that increase was sustained when we tested it over the next 3 years. That innovative approach is now providing clean water for about 2 million people each day across Kenya, Uganda, and Malawi. As these examples illustrate, the experimental approach can be useful both for science, understanding the world, and for innovation, improving the world. By creating an opportunity for more rapid feedback loops, it can allow science and innovation to move forward together, quickly, in a mutually reinforcing process. As we see in biology and in the market, systems which create variation in approaches and then select for the most successful ones can be a hugely powerful force for change. Private firms are continuously doing their own experiments in the form of A/B tests, figuring out which innovations work, refining them, and scaling them up. But there are some areas where the private sector won't invest as enthusiastically, even if innovation could serve important human needs. A key insight from the study of innovation is that social choices around institutions play a key role in determining both the pace of technological change and whether the direction of this change matches human needs. There's room for innovation in the set of institutions society has created for stimulating innovation. I'd like to discuss 3 sets of institutions: those which facilitate experimentation, those through which governments and philanthropists can directly support innovation, and institutions which incentivize the private sector to create specific new technologies, like vaccines, where existing incentives are not fully aligned with social needs. So starting with institutions to facilitate experiments. The scale, complexity, and collaborative nature of experimental work means that it requires new institutions. When I first started conducting research in Busia, we had to create everything from scratch. A number of wonderful colleagues and students, including Karen Levy, Carolyn Nikesa, Ted Miguel, and Pascaline Dupas, generously helped to build up a local research infrastructure. Our efforts had an important impact in enabling further research in Kenya. But Esther Duflo, Abhijit Banerjee, Iqbal Dhaliwal, and my wife Rachel at JPEL, and Dean Carlin and Annie Duflo at IPA systematically created a global research infrastructure. Colleagues in the field have developed many other institutions, including Evidence Action, Precision Agriculture for Development, CID at Harvard, SIGA at Berkeley, and IGC. We need innovation in funding institutions as well. So I co-founded and serve as scientific director for Development Innovation Ventures, a fund within the U.S. Agency for International Development. DIV supports innovations for development from a wide variety of sources, including social entrepreneurs, for-profit firms, and researchers. DIV is deliberately open across sectors and geographies, and to innovations intended to scale either commercially or through developing country governments or donors. We complement this openness with a tiered, evidence-based approach to funding. DIV makes small investments to pilot and rigorously test promising ideas, and larger ones to help innovations that are supported by rigorous empirical evidence to transition to scale. We recently analyzed DIV's early portfolio. The social benefit of just 4 of DIV's first 43 investments were 5 times as large as the cost of the entire portfolio. We also found that innovations involving development economics researchers were 6 times more likely to reach more than 1 million users as those without. Our results suggest that there's potential for this type of open, tiered, evidence-based innovation fund to deliver high returns for society. They also suggest that social science researchers, accustomed to the experimental approach, have a place alongside social entrepreneurs, technologists, and others in developing and scaling innovations. Rachel Glenister, Chris Snyder, Owen Barter, and I have also been involved in research on ways to harness the power and energy of private sector innovation to address specific needs of some of the world's poorest people. So, for example, under current institutions, the private sector may not invest enough in vaccines needed in developing countries. We propose that donors commit in advance to help finance the purchase of vaccines for developing country needs if they were developed. Such a commitment could both provide an incentive for the development of such vaccines and ensure that if the vaccines were developed, price would not be a barrier to access. A group of donors committed $1.5 billion to such an approach for a vaccine against the strains of pneumococcus common in developing countries. At the time, pneumococcus killed 1.6 million people each year. Following the adoption of the advanced market commitment, 2 firms developed pneumococcus vaccines appropriate for the strains common in developing countries. And those have now been distributed to more than 200 million children across the developing world. These examples demonstrate that innovation in institutions supporting technological development has the potential to both accelerate technological progress and shape it to human needs. To summarize, experiments are a way to get at causal impact, but they're also much more than that. They give the researcher a richer sense of context, promote broader collaboration, and address specific practical problems. They provide the potential for rapid iteration both within and across teams. Together, these features make the experimental approach a useful tool for both science and innovation. One key challenge for the future will be the development of appropriate institutions to accelerate innovation and to direct it toward addressing human needs. There's much more to be done. The spread of mobile phones, the availability of large data sets, and the development of machine learning are opening up tremendous opportunities for digital development in areas from education to agriculture. For example, Precision Agriculture for Development, an NGO which I helped co-found, is now working with governments and private firms in multiple countries to provide digital agricultural extension to millions of farmers. But this is just the beginning. We need to encourage a variety of new approaches to take advantage of new opportunities, test new approaches, refine them, and scale up the most effective solutions. As recent work has demonstrated, experiments can be applied to a wide range of problems, from controlling corruption, to encouraging political participation, to fighting climate change, to addressing inequality in countries at a wide range of different income levels. As Esther, Abhijit, and I have emphasized, this is a prize not just for the 3 of us, but for a broader movement involving researchers, nonprofit organizations, businesses, and governments that want to improve what they're doing for the broader good and are courageous enough to try new approaches and rigorously test them. This movement has much left to accomplish and plenty of room to grow. It requires many people in many different roles, be they researchers or survey enumerators, entrepreneurs, or policymakers. To keep the field moving, we must support the next generation of researchers to address a new set of questions. For a number of years, the Weiss family has generously supported the Weiss Family Fund for Development Economics Research. The fund provides grants primarily to graduate students and junior faculty at a number of U.S. universities, for research intended to advance the well-being of the poorest. Abhijit, Esther, and I, along with the Weiss family, wanted to expand access to this program to outstanding researchers around the world. I'm very pleased to announce that the three of us will be contributing the funds from the prize, and that the Weiss family will be making a much larger $50 million donation to extend the program worldwide, in particular to strong researchers and institutions in developing countries. We are confident that this commitment will empower a broader set of people to use the experimental approach to advance science, inform policies to address poverty, and develop and scale innovative solutions to address human needs. Together, thanks to our partners, we've made substantial progress. However, when these celebrations conclude, there will still be millions of people who wake each day in poverty. We must work together, push on, and push harder. And we will.
Wait here on stage. Wait here. Yeah, please. Very good. So I will not try to summarize what we have heard in these brilliant lectures, but let me at least end with the reflection. So in many ways, there are peculiar circumstances that paved the way for the research for which you're now being awarded. So it's kind of tempting to ask what would have happened had Abhijit not had he remained an economic theorist, not learned so much from his development students, had Esther not gone to Moscow, and had Michael not been volunteering in Kenya. Now, that's a counterfactual question. It is about a hypothetical life compared to an outcome in real life. And many in the audience have made a career out of answering such counterfactual questions via clever field experiments. However, this one, I think, would require a very clever design. You know, it's maybe possible for particles to be in two places at the same time, at least in the wonderful world of quantum physics. But so far, we haven't figured out a way for people to be in two places at the same time, not even in the wonderful world of economic field experiments. Maybe this is as well, because we wouldn't like to put the wonderful lifetime achievements of Michael, Esther, and Abhijit at risk. Would you join me in a last applause for the 2019 laureates?